Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much all for coming, and I think the fact that the very full room speaks to the problem that we have got with childhood obesity in this country. I'm just an enthusiastic amateur. I think when we started this report, we had no idea perhaps how challenging the subject was going to be. But why does it matter? And why do we as Conservatives think that there should be interventions in this space? We're not in favour of the nanny state. But I think we all know that this is too important not to get involved. We're talking about children's lives, and we're also talking about the cost to the National Health Service, which is absolutely enormous. Now, I was a fat child. I didn't like it. It's horrible. I'm quite a fat grown-up, actually, but I don't like that either. But we live in an increasingly obesogenic society. Anybody you see today who is slim, you think they are somebody of immense discipline, and we've got a very disciplined panel here today. And we have to support our children to live a healthier and longer life, and if we don't do anything, that's not going to happen. I saw a cartoon the other day that had a mother hauling her child in, holding a football. Time to stop playing the football. That was from like 10 years ago, and today they're hauling a child in who's just holding their tablet. I mean, my children ran around, and today's children just don't. So we've got some big challenges, and we've got a great panel who are going to explore some of those challenges. We are expecting the Secretary of State to pop in. He's got a very busy schedule, obviously. So when he arrives, we're going to interrupt whoever is doing their presentation, and Jeremy will speak briefly to us, and we're very grateful to him for making the time this evening. I'm extremely grateful to the panel for making their time as well. They're all passionate. They all got great expertise. And I'd very much like to welcome the first person, is it Dolly, is you? Dolly, to the panel, who has been the researcher for the report for the Centre for Social Justice, and she will go through the background and the presentation about the report we're going to be launching later in the month. Thank you, Dolly.
Thank you, Anne. So as Anne said, we have been working on a report for about a year now, started just in November last year, and James was one of the working group members, so very delighted to have him here as well. I just wanted to give a bit of a background of why the CSJ decided to explore the issue of childhood obesity, because it is not usually an area of policy that we delve into. There are a lot of health think tanks out there that are known to be talking about this issue, and this is something we haven't discussed before. I think we've only really touched upon mental health in this agenda previously. So we came to this issue because we couldn't ignore the disproportionate link between childhood obesity and poverty. We chose England to look at because there's sort of a lot of different things going on regionally. So we decided to concentrate it on England. And we decided to concentrate on childhood obesity because for us, we look at the root causes and we want to try and tackle poverty at its earliest possible stage. So childhood obesity for us just seemed a natural sort of area to focus on, natural age group to focus on. And also because childhood obesity is about children. We have the Secretary of State just arrived, so we will welcome him to the stage. Please, Jeremy, do come and join us. We decided to pick children because they are not personally responsible. So all of the issues that we've talked about personal responsibility and individual responsibility to take on this issue, children, they are not personally responsible, and we felt it was an issue we couldn't ignore anymore. But we would love to hear you speak while we've got your 5 or 10 minutes.
Okay. Sorry, I wasn't expecting to say anything at all. Ian Duncan-Smith told me I must come along and thank you for having this meeting and just support the work you're doing to make us do more on childhood obesity. I do believe that it is now overtaking smoking as our biggest public health risk, and it is worthy of a lot of thought. We have made very good progress with the sugar tax that was introduced. That's already had a very big effect on encouraging supermarkets to reformulate their products. It's a very complex issue because, unlike smoking, where all smoking is bad for your health, it is possible to eat things like chocolate in sensible quantities and as part of a healthy diet. And we have to understand the differences that it means. But the truth is we have to do a lot more. We are the second most obese nation in Europe, and when it comes to children, we're right up in the top few. And so I particularly commend the work that Hon Jenkin is leading. And I think the only other point I would make is that there is a big social justice issue, which is why I think it's a very important area for the CSJ to focus on, because this does disproportionately affect children from poorer backgrounds, from troubled families. The fact is that a lot of the cheapest food is the most unhealthy. And so part of this will be to develop a better and more constructive relationship with the food industry about the way they formulate their products and the way they market their products. And my strong belief is that the food industry should not put their heads in the sand on this. They do not want to become the next big tobacco, and that means they have to be responsible and understand that if they work with us, and at the moment they are saying that they are still planning to stick to the target we've set of reducing the calories in food consumed by children by 20% in 4 years. Well, we really want to see progress on that, because if we don't, we will then be asking ourselves what more will have to be done to tackle this very big problem. Anyway, I'm an interloper here today, but I just wanted to express my support for the work you're all doing, and I hope you have a very good meeting and a very constructive discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy, so much. And I also want to take the opportunity while he's here just to celebrate the fact that the Childhood Obesity Plan has been published. But I would just want to touch upon a few issues before then. So welcoming the Childhood Obesity Plan, but as it states in it, it is only the start of the conversation, and it's very good to hear that the Secretary of State agrees that there needs to be a lot more done. And we also, in this report, when it is published, and we will be sending it out and doing a sort of big media stint over that month, so you'll hopefully be able to get your hands on a copy. We highlight the fact that there is already so much being done, but the rates are depressing. So I'm just going to do a brief overview that obesity rates are increasing for England's poorest children, and they're actually levelling out or going down for the richest children. By age 5, children in poverty are twice more likely to be obese than their least deprived peers, and by age 11, they are 3 times more likely. The stats are 1 in 5 children are obese or overweight by the time they start primary school, and by the time they leave, they are 1 in 3 are likely to be obese or overweight. And childhood obesity rates are higher among black and minority ethnic children. The gap between the least and most deprived children is growing. As you can see, there's almost a 2 percentage point increase since 2007-8 for both reception year and year 6. And diet-related diseases are incredibly disproportionately likely to be amongst the most deprived children. So the most deprived here almost account for 50% of the cases of type 2 diabetes during childhood, whereas only 6.8% for the least deprived. Also, when it comes to poor dental health, you can see that it is incredibly focused on deprived areas again. Children in poverty are also more likely to experience acute social problems. So if you're familiar with the CSJ's work, you'll know about the 5 pathways to poverty. So not only is a child more likely to be obese during childhood, they're more likely to experience family breakdown, educational failure, addiction to alcohol and drugs in the household, serious personal debt within their household, and worklessness. Ultimately, the causes we know are unhealthy eating, so the excessive consumption of unhealthy foods, and a sedentary lifestyle. However, this fails to account for the unfavourable obesogenic conditions which Anne touched upon, and the everyday challenges, particular challenges that families in poverty face. And the government childhood obesity plan recognises this, and it says that there are many drivers, including behaviour, environment, genetics, and culture. This is just an example of the number of risk factors for childhood obesity, including family conflict during meal times, low educational attainment, low income, cognitive overload from acute social problems, poor diet, living in poor or unsuitable housing, etc., which are all explored in the report as well. But it just shows there are so many drivers. And it's interesting, the childhood obesity plan actually calls unhealthy eating and a sedentary lifestyle the root causes. We believe the root causes are these issues that then drive the behaviour of unhealthy consumption and sedentary lifestyle. We then came across Amsterdam, and it has become our sort of model for success. They launched in 2013 the Amsterdam Healthy Weight Programme, which was launched predominantly because of the Deputy Mayor, Eric van der Berg, who said enough was enough, and they have much lower rates than us as well, so it's not as if they're one of the worst countries in Europe. And they introduced this whole system, sort of holistic approach to tackling childhood obesity. The first thing they decided to do was to area target, so to focus on areas which had the highest childhood obesity rates, and those happened obviously to be the most deprived areas. So this is an example of how they have targeted it. They base it upon this famous model, which is a holistic approach, and the idea is that you can't take a single area and choose to intervene in that field. You have to take a whole systems approach and take it all together. So it includes things in the education side, working environment, dealing disproportionately with the link between poverty and obesity, healthcare professionals, housing, you name it. So they have introduced it based on this model, and they've got one in one of their reports on in the City of Amsterdam website, which sort of indicates how they've transferred this model to be applicable in Amsterdam. Some of the examples of their intervention areas are in schools, community, the healthy environment, training. They're massive on professionals, so every contact point counts, whether it's a teacher, a health professional, a parent, someone in the supermarket. Everyone is responsible for this, and it shouldn't be about picking out, who is it, the politicians or the teachers or doctors. It's everyone has their responsibility with tackling this issue. I took these photos when I was in Amsterdam, but just to give you an example of some of the interventions in supermarkets, so free fruit, which is happening in Tesco's now for children, price reductions on healthy foods. This is traffic light labelling, which a lot of you will probably be familiar with over here, that they've blown up so that you do think about the sugar content when you are shopping for sugary drinks, and it transfers down. So one that is, dark red, very sugary, will have the label down by the drink. The results so far, so this is the reason why we came across it, because I came across the results earlier this year and thought, blimey, how have they managed to do this? A 12% reduction in childhood obesity rates among all children, an 18% reduction among the most deprived children. 102 primary schools are now part of this out of 225. They're piloting a healthy program in 16 preschools, so looking at the early intervention. More babies are being breastfed. Primary school children are drinking sugary drinks less often, are doing more exercise. 58% of sport events are child marketing proof, which basically means no unhealthy foods or drinks advertised in any sporting event that comes into that category. And all subway stations have banned the advertisement of all unhealthy drinks, which was that was announced about a month ago. So it's in development. So I'll go back to these because it links on to how this is applicable. When we went over, it was very interesting. We talked to the team there and sort of said, what are the interventions that you've introduced? We become obsessed with, is it a sugar tax? Is it things in schools? And she said, stop asking what we're introducing. It is how and why. Why? Because it's a problem, and the statistics show that we cannot ignore that anymore. How? Political leadership, saying we can and we will end childhood obesity. And that is what we are calling on the government to do, to state that we can and we will end childhood obesity. Step 2, which they managed to secure predominantly because of Eric van der Berg's leadership in Amsterdam, was cross-party, cross-departmental, cross-sector commitment. No one pointing fingers, we're all in this together, and we are all committing to the targets set. And the targets are purposely unrealistic. They want to end childhood obesity by 2033. And the idea was that when they launched it in 2013, it's by the time children born then would be 20 years old, so to have all healthy children by that year. They also, a critical element of it was setting up an independent monitoring and evaluation body, which predominantly made up of academics that could constantly monitor. So you, instead of saying, okay, we'll check how things are going in 5 years, and if they're going well, you have no idea why they're going well, and if they're going badly, you won't be able to point out what's going badly. It is about consistent monitoring and evaluation, which the government, there is a body that the government have just announced launching a £5 million project, which is a childhood obesity research unit in the Department of Health. And we look at that being an opportunity for this sort of independent evaluating model to be channeled through. And then they map the current policy areas, and I know that Zac will touch on this when he speaks, but there is a massive overlap with so many other policy areas. And instead of saying we're going to, invest X amount in a childhood obesity strategy, we say the first step they must take is actually mapping what's already being done, because it's amazing. You go into every department and loads is already being done. The walkability, cyclability strategy that was launched earlier this year is 1.2 billion. You've got breakfast clubs that are 10 million. You start piecing everything together and you've got a massive budget. And we're sort of saying you don't really need to sort of worry about investing lots more. It's more the joining up of the amazing stuff that's already going on. Setting goals, setting unrealistic goals, ending childhood obesity by 2050 or 2030, whatever it is, and then setting the short, medium, and long-term goals in between then. And then area targeting. We have mayors now, a lot of them, and they should be responsible for the development of these programs in their areas and making sure they're targeted and they're local, because an intervention that works in Manchester might not be appropriate in London, and we sort of say that we don't need that blanket, be obsessed with sort of the blanket approach. And then finally, you get onto the what. Then to explore and adopt multiple interventions across multiple sectors. But until you have committed, until you have set your targets, until you know what's actually already going on, only then can you understand what to do next. And we said to base it on the Mitchie behaviour change wheel model, which is one of the most comprehensive models for behaviour change. And it looks predominantly at the fact that behaviours are defined by capability, opportunity, and motivation. And you've got several policy areas and intervention functions to choose from. And the point, again, coming back to the earlier model that Amsterdam used, you can't just pick and choose. You have to do it holistically and use a kind of whole systems approach. Over to James.
Good evening, and firstly, thank you all for coming. I think the reason you're here is very much the same as why I jumped at the chance to be on the panel and work on the report, because it is something that's going to affect us going forward, and then our kids and their kids. So it's a hugely important issue we need to get right straight away. Dave's done a really good job of setting the scene for it. I'm going to concentrate more on the brief of physical activity and the fact that with the hypothesis, which sounds slightly strange for a sportsman, that you can't outrun a bad diet. Start off with the childhood obesity strategy and it being the first step. There's the making the healthy choice, the easy choice, 37-page strategy that was initially introduced, but has now been sort of rationed into the childhood obesity plan. And unfortunately, from my perspective, the ambition's been reduced with the aim of reducing childhood obesity rates over the next 10 years, significantly reducing. But there's nothing to hold it to account, and without any specific target, it could be very easily just slip. And that's why it is important. It's the first step, not the defining step, and it's good to hear that people echo that, Jeremy Hunt echo that it is the first step. Sugar tax has obviously been mentioned a couple of times. I think it's too narrow and should have not only applied to carbonated drinks, but it needs to sugar, dairy drinks. If you think, one of those fridge milkshakes has twice as much sugar in it as a Coke. So you realise if they're exempt, you need to have a level playing field. Powder drinks and syrups are also exempt. And I think it's the combination of arguably the influence of the food industry and the fact that physical activity is cheap, that it's been increased in importance in the childhood obesity plan. And that, though, combined with a wide sort of flannel of significantly reduced without any targets, means it's actually not quite possible to set any limits and then gauge our improvement. And that's what we need. We need it to have some teeth and to actually make a significant difference. But before I come on to the hypothesis of whether you can outrun a bad diet, to be honest, Mo Farah can't even outrun a bad diet. We need to make clear the difference between burning calories and actually physical activity, because physical activity is often held as a silver bullet for nailing obesity, which on the one hand overstates the effectiveness of physical activity and oversimplifies the psychological, physiological and sociological conditions that give rise to obesity and was pointed out. And it also ignores the critical health benefits that physical activity give us. And there are 4 big causes of preventable ill health: smoking, poor nutrition, physical inactivity, and alcoholic excess. And we can control them all. The evidence suggests that small amounts of regular exercise, so 5 times a week for half an hour, brings dramatic benefits. And in managing 20 chronic conditions, it's not sprinting around like Mo Farah, Usain Bolt. It's moderate, maybe slightly out of breath or a little bit sweaty, with an increased heart rate. And they include coronary disease, strokes, type 2 diabetes, cancer, musculoskeletal, and also exercise is as effective as therapy for reducing symptoms of depression, anxiety, and stress. So physical activity is something we should build into our lives. Also, children, it's more worrying when you really delve into it. And the benefits of physical activity to start with, the link between academic performance and physical fitness is there in all socioeconomic groups. And there's an inverse association between physical activity and reported violent, antisocial, behavioural problems in school. Physical education, sport, games have a positive impact on, obviously, physical health, cognitive function, and social function. And the physical activity habits in childhood determine how active you're going to be as an adult. And physical activity, again, don't confuse this with sport. If it were a drug, physical activity, with its benefits on mental well-being, mental fitness, heart disease, obesity, diabetes, osteoporosis, no politician would hold that pill, and that's what physical activity is. If you look at the state of play of physical activity, which is something we can control, it is arguably the most important public health problem of the 21st century. So the World Health Organization, inactivity is the 4th leading cause globally of one of the major health threats, and especially affecting developed countries. And the UK government, the country is less physically active than any time in all human history. That's the state where we are at the moment. And just a few figures. So a couple of years ago, 39% of men, 29% of women failed to meet the 2.5 hours recommended level of exercise a week. But yet, on average, we watch 27.5 hours television. So not having time is not an excuse. And actually, those are people filling in, monitoring of how much telly they watch and how much exercise they do. And if it's measured objectively, that falls significantly to less than 10% for both genders. 25% of the population is active in moderate intensity, so a quick walk for less than 30 minutes a week. Walking trips have decreased 30% between 1995 and 2013. 2/3 of our trips are made by car, 20% on foot, 2% by bike. And this is the killer for me. 20% of adults walk for 20 minutes at a stretch once a year or less. So you think 1 out of 5 doesn't walk for 20 minutes. If you walk 3 miles an hour, is a mile in one go. They do it once a year. That's not sport, that's just moving more. And over the last 50 years, we know physical activities have gone down by 20%, and the UK are predicting a further 15% drop by 2030. And actually, I hope this won't be true, but by 2030, the average Brit will be so inactive, they'll only use 25% more energy during the day when they're awake than they are when they're asleep. So that's the level of where we are now. It's not going to solve obesity, it's just part of the problem. You take it, more importantly, onto the kids in England. 33% of boys, 21% of girls between 4 and 15 meet the minimum levels of physical activity. Another 50% of boys, 2/3 of girls, fail to achieve half the recommended level. So we're not there, and it's not running miles, it's 60 minutes of moderate activity a day. In 1970, 50% of kids walked to school. 2013, there were 13%. And 50% of pupils living within 400 metres got driven to school. That's what we need to build into our society. And the problem is also at school as well. 7 to 8 hours a day is obligatory sedentary activity, so you have no choice but to be inactive. The active transport is deemed unsafe by parents, and then outside of school there's safe access to recreational activities, and they're governed by financial, geographical and political. They're all beyond the child's control. And yes, we can say the positive steps about sugar tax, but physical inactivity is not taken seriously enough by policymakers, the health community and practitioners both at local and national level. It's seen as an optional part of life rather than the focal point of a health strategy with its own resource and direct attention. And this is one of the real killers for me. The Behaviour and Disciplines in School paper gave advice for unruly behaviour, and there was, if poor behaviour is identified, sanctions should be implemented consistently and fairly in line with the behaviour policy. That's a quote from the paper. And so 10 measures are listed, one of which is extra physical activity, such as running around a playing field. So if someone misbehaves, you punish them with physical activity, which is not the right message for physical activity in my mind. Coming on now onto the point of not being able to outrun a bad diet. And this is where physical activity and its place in the whole obesity equation fits in. The Behavioural Insights team stated that reductions in physical activity do not provide a realistic explanation for the change in people's weight. So it's not how little we're moving, it's actually, we can go on about reformulation, but also we're eating more than we need. The Department of Health said, although physical activity brings important health benefits for those who are overweight and obese, eating and drinking less is the key to weight loss. And it goes on to say, increasing physical activity is unlikely to be the best single strategy for combating excess weight. So despite all the problems we have with physical activity, we still have to do it among so many other areas within society. And personally, I'm unaware of any credible exercise specialist, and unfortunately I've met a few, who has suggested that exercise alone is sufficient for weight management. Obesity is a complex, bio-psychosocial problem, and it requires a multifaceted, multi-agency response. And so no one initiative is enough to tackle the problem. And the one thing that will tackle it, that takes time, is behavioural change. And that is where the Amsterdam model comes in, of just not focusing on one, but a whole holistic approach. And if you simplify it to one thing, it's erroneous, misleading, and it's bound to fail. I'll round off with actually going back to the hypothesis of if you can outrun a bad diet. Here's an example. I feel quite bad now when there's beer and wine and nice food going on around here. But so a mid-morning snack, right? You have a blueberry muffin and medium latte, if you like that. So if you walk at 3 miles an hour with your having had a muffin and a latte, that will take you 1 hour 40 minutes to burn off. So you realise how we were suddenly culling our day of being productive, unless you're a full-time athlete, in which case you have to do it. Or you have to run for 53 minutes at 5 miles an hour. So lunch, and for me it's not a big lunch, 2 slices of pizza and a can of a drink of your choice. That's 1 hour 49 minutes of walking, or 57 minutes of running. And a sandwich you buy from a shop, 1 hour 20 minutes of walking. You realise suddenly if you put all your food in one day, you will not have a time to do your job, to exercise, to eat, and obviously to then watch the 27.5 hours of telly that we all have to watch. And I can see the beers in the background, and I have one on the table there. So 1 pint of lager I really feel bad putting a dampener on your evening as the last thing I'm going to say. But so 1 pint of lager is 10% of the male daily calories that you have. So if you have 10 pints of a lager tonight, you hopefully won't have eaten anything else today. Or if you have 20 pints, you can't eat anything tomorrow either. So enjoy it while you can, and just remember it's one part of the big picture. Right, is it you there?
Well done.
Thank you very much indeed. Lovely, James. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Dolly, for putting this together and a brilliant opening remarks. The Centre for Social Justice is really a pioneering organisation, so I can't continue without acknowledging that Ian Duncan Smith, who founded it, is standing here like a Goliath at the end of the room. It does some extraordinary work, and the issue that you have picked for this event today really could not be more important. The truth is that things have moved. In terms of the corporate behavior that Dolly was talking about in her presentation, in the last 20 years, things have moved. I remember 22, 23 years ago, there were a couple of activists. I knew who they were. They were sort of long-haired, black-toothed, really kind of sort of hippie greens. But I happened to know them because I was editing The Ecologist at the time. And they sprung a trap on McDonald's. They were outside McDonald's handing out the usual leaflets, saying all the things that people have been saying for years about McDonald's: rainforest destruction, marketing to children, rubbish in the food that they were serving, endless cases, endless examples of environmental damage. And they were handing this thing out, and McDonald's had a sort of usual formula for dealing with people like that, which was to threaten legal action. What they didn't know was that these two activists had an army behind them. They had experts all around the world who were lining up and ready to come and help fight what eventually became known as the McLibel campaign. And my job at the time, being great pals of Swampy and his ilk at the time, was to raise money for this campaign, which I did enthusiastically. And I just remember they went through all these different issues, and you had the head of McDonald's UK, who was being grilled by a barrister, and he was asked all the questions you would expect him to be asked, and he handled them reasonably well. But then he was asked, how can you justify advertising, marketing this stuff as nutritious to children, which is what they were doing at the time? And he paused, and he didn't have an answer. He said, well, they have nutrients in them, our packages. And the barrister said, well, by the same logic, so too are my children's nappies nutritious, because nutrients occur all over the place. And you just wouldn't have McDonald's today behaving in the same way. Things have moved so dramatically in the last 20 years. And I'm not here to sing the praises of McDonald's, but the shift from where they were 20 years ago to where they are today is really quite staggering. Now, I was going to talk a little bit about the need to, I guess many of the points that James was just talking about, activity, the need to get people moving, but he's dealt with that, so I'm going to skip over the area. But I just want to make one point, and that is that if you properly address an issue such as inactivity, particularly among young people, if you address that issue properly, you're going to find yourself addressing all kinds of other issues as well. That's true with most problems. You deal with a problem properly, you find yourself dealing with problems that you hadn't anticipated dealing with. If you get people moving, you get people walking to school, for example, you get people out of their cars, get people doing that 20 minutes a day, or whatever the target is that people need to aspire to. You're not just dealing with obesity, you're dealing with mental health, you're dealing with attentiveness among children in school, you're dealing with behavioral issues, that you're probably, hopefully, also going to be dealing with the fact that we've lost a playing field every 2 weeks for the last 15 years, which is something that simply has to stop. You're dealing with a whole range of other issues. And that is equally true of school food. And that's the point that, if I have time, that's the point that I want to make here today. School food. School food for a lot of people is the only meal that they can reliably expect to have. It's the only opportunity that many kids have to enjoy a proper, square, solid meal. And yet too many children around the country are not tapping into that. But that could be changed, and it could be changed relatively easily. And in fact, the action that government would need to take in order to address that issue has been made easier by Brexit, and I'm going to explain why in a second. We spend £2 billion a year, or thereabouts, on food for schools and hospitals and prisons and our military. £2 billion of public money. Can you imagine the impact if those £2 billion were invested, instead of junk, which has been the case for so long, on sustainable, ideally domestically produced food. It would have an immediate electrifying impact in terms of our rural economy. We'd flood the rural economy, which is struggling, with much needed support. We'd be giving children, patients, prisoners, soldiers, and so on, really the best quality food. It would be a triple whammy with the use of existing funds. We're not talking about expanding that budget, we're talking about using it more intelligently. Now, I remember talking in Parliament when I was first elected, talking to successive ministers in the Department for the Environment, but I also spoke to ministers in the Department for Health. And every time I raised this issue, I said, why don't you do this? It's crazy to be spending this money on junk from the other side of the world when we could be supporting our own farmers and giving people good quality food. And the same answer came back every time: we can't afford it. It's going to push costs through the roof, and we'll be, having the budget will mushroom. Well, I set up a group in Richmond and Kingston called School Food Matters, whose job was to do just that, to try and persuade the local primary schools to change their contracts so that instead of buying the usual stuff pre-cooked and imported into the school, that they would prepare food on site based on good domestic, sustainably produced foods, raw materials. And after 10 years, we have succeeded. Dramatically so. Every single primary school now in Richmond has the gold standard Soil Association mark, the Food for Life standard, the very best you can get. All their ingredients are sustainable. Almost all of them are British. In other words, the food miles has been cut massively as a consequence of this. The take-up by children of school food has gone up 300% over the course of this time, and every single one of those schools produces the food in-house. They don't have it brought in by contractors. Now, we've done all that. And the same, by the way, is happening in Kingston. They're trailing a bit, but we're getting there. We've done all that, and at the same time, the cost has come down. So per meal, the cost is now 38 pence cheaper than it was. We've gone from serving the worst food, environmentally disastrous and nutritionally repellent, and pretty much disgusting as well, judging by the fact that no one wanted to eat it. We've gone from that to the best in the country. And we're doing it with a smaller budget. We're doing it for less. There's absolutely no reason why this cannot be generalized throughout the country. There is no reason why this can't become national policy. There are pockets of what we've done in Richmond and Kingston happening all over the country, but it's not happening as a whole. And this is something that I hope Michael Gove will do. The other argument, incidentally, when I took it to ministers, well, that would breach our agreements with the European Union. Well, that is a problem which we will not be having to deal with in a few months' time. So it is a big opportunity for us. And I think that's something I certainly have an ambition to see Michael Gove introduce this as a policy for the entire country. But the other issue which is linked, and I know I'm going to go off piste here, but I wasn't given absolute instructions. I think you said I could talk about whatever I wanted. The other issue which is linked is air quality. So we do want to get our kids out and about. We do want them to be playing outdoors. We want them to be walking to school. We want to be more like Japan in that respect, where kids do walk to school as a matter of course. It's the rule, not the exception, whereas here people tend not to do so. We want to get to that world, but we equally need the air that our kids are breathing to be clean. And it's not at the moment. We are in the midst of an air quality crisis, particularly in London. But we've now reached a level of early deaths attributed to pollution that is comparable to the smogs of London 60 years ago. The same number of people are dying early today as were dying 60 years ago, when the Clean Air Act was born on the back of what they recognized then was a crisis. It is a crisis again today, and I think it has to be treated as a crisis. And the truth is we have all the tools we need already to deal with this issue. As it is next year, as a consequence of a decision Boris took just before he stopped being Mayor of London, every single new black cab from next year will be electric, 100% electric, every single black cab. It's a beautiful design as well. But there's no reason why we can't retrofit existing cabs. It can be done in a cost-neutral manner, pay back after 2.5 years. Every single black cab using existing TfL funds could be retrofitted with a payback after 2.5 years, massively reducing diesel pollution in our city. We could do the same thing with our buses. And some of you might remember I ran for that office myself. It was a dark period in many respects. I ran for the office myself last year, and I did the maths on this, and I worked out, working with TfL, that we could do the same with our buses, 100% zero emission or very close to zero emission with the older buses, and we could do that within existing TfL budgets. That could happen within 2 or 3 years. 14% of the particulate pollution, particulate matter that we breathe in London comes from works vehicles. Well, there isn't a construction company in London that doesn't at some point or another do work for councils or the GLA or City Hall. So let's stop awarding contracts to companies whose works vehicles are emitting that level of pollution. Let's demand that those machines are retrofitted. We are on the cusp now of an electric car revolution, and I don't know whether she's already spoken. I only arrived a couple of hours ago at conference, but if she has or hasn't yet, or if she's about to tomorrow, Claire Perry will present a really ambitious, radical plan for stimulating this electric vehicle revolution in our country, and her enthusiasm for it is really infectious, and it's a wonderful thing, and I feel in her hands we're going to see great things. But we can't wait for that. We've got to demand action now. We now need to behave in the way that our predecessors 60 years ago behaved during the Great Smogs. We need a Clean Air Act to pull together all the different strands, and we need to react as if this is a crisis. Now, I'm very ambitious for this government. I think Michael Gove is doing a superb job. He's defying expectations. I came from earlier before this event from a discussion with a quite radical conservation group, one that I can absolutely guarantee has never flirted with the Conservative Party before. And they tell me that they're planning to put a big poster up of Michael Gove in their office, which would be an extraordinary turnaround. The work he is doing in that department in just the last few weeks is exciting. So I feel that in his hands there is a drive, there's an enthusiasm, there's an excitement about nailing these problems. And as far as I'm concerned, we ought to back him because we have a lot to do. Thanks very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. I don't think you need me to give you any more shocking facts and stats about obesity in the UK. And I don't think we've come here to make the case that we've got an obesity crisis. That's a given. And we're here because we want to see it tackled boldly by government. I will throw in one more grisly fact for good measure. Amputations related to type 2 diabetes are the fastest growing surgical procedures in the NHS. People are literally losing limbs because we're not tackling this problem properly. And that one resonates for me particularly because of two people that I've been filming with for my BBC documentary series on the national obesity crisis. When I first met Jeannie, her father Bill, a type 2 diabetes sufferer, was in hospital having his left leg amputated above the knee. The second time I visited, he was at home and I chatted to him in his wheelchair. He showed me the gangrenous toe on the foot of his remaining leg, and he said he thought they had it under control. Well, I'm no expert, but it didn't look good to me. And a few weeks ago, Bill went back into hospital and had his second leg removed. And despite the obvious and graphic warning of having a dad who's lost 2 legs to amputations from type 2 diabetes, Jeannie is herself seriously overweight and at risk of developing type 2 diabetes. She's one of millions of people in the UK who's clinically obese. She knows that that's likely to affect her health, and yet she finds it extremely hard to make those changes that could save her life. People like Jeannie and Bill don't deserve our derision, though they will get it from time to time from people who think that losing weight, not falling into the obesity trap, is purely a matter of willpower. They don't want our sympathy, although now that I know them both, they certainly have mine. What they need is help. And they've needed it for decades, and if they'd had it when they needed it, Bill would still be walking, and Jeannie would not be facing the likelihood of shorter life expectancy. Now, Jeannie and Bill live in Newcastle, where I've been spending a lot of time filming since the beginning of the year. Why Newcastle? Well, I wanted to go somewhere where I could get a clear snapshot of the weight-related health issues facing ordinary people up and down the country. And as a city, Newcastle is bang on average. It's also an amazingly open and hospitable city with a great team spirit, and I felt I could work with that. So in January this year, I set Newcastle the bold challenge of losing £100,000 in weight in the course of a year. It sounds mad, but I thought if I could inspire a community of people to come together and encourage each other to think differently, to make it, first of all, okay to talk about their weight, to support each other's efforts to turn their lives around, maybe we could start something that might catch on and we could roll it out around the country. And so we engage with businesses and services all over the city, rallying their employees to get on board. We're working with policemen and bus drivers, call centre workers and corner shop owners. And we've joined up with all manner of grassroots organisations in the city, with Newcastle City Council, with pharmacies and GPs. And we've even turned the high streets into a play street. I've met a lot of inspiring people who've transformed their lives, completely renegotiating their relationship with food and exercise, the very difficult balancing act that James has referred to today. I've met people who've done it in the most brilliant way. They surprise themselves. And I've met others who are just still struggling, who can't seem whatever they do to achieve their weight loss goals. It's been a really tough challenge, and our ticker that records all the weight lost in those who've signed up to Newcastle Can is currently just over £20,000. We've got a long way to go. It's a great achievement for the 6,000 people who've got involved, but it's just proving really, really tough. But throughout the whole time I've been making this program, I've just begun to find out how deep the obesity problem goes and how complicated it is. I've spoken to doctors and nurses and pharmacists who tell me it's really, really hard to address the issue with the people who come in and see them. Just breaching the subject of weight as a health problem is incredibly hard. But I've also seen things being done that I'm convinced, if they were rolled out, could help this generation and, even more importantly, the next. I'll be featuring some of those ideas in my film, but I know damn well that TV programs are not going to solve this problem. I think it's a job for government, and that's why I'm here. We've been talking about solving what is now an epidemic for decades, but not nearly enough action has been taken. Here, now, we've got to put right those missed opportunities. Millions of lives of the old, the young, and the not yet born depend on it. And there's one vital shift, an urgent shift of culture that needs to occur. And it seems to have been something of a blind spot for successive governments. But it's obvious to almost all professionals working in this area that we've got to place much more emphasis on preventing weight-related diseases rather than just treating them. Treatment of type 2 diabetes is costing the NHS £8.8 billion a year. How much of that could we save if we prevented a quarter, maybe a half, maybe 3/4 of the 3.8 million people who have type 2 diabetes in this country? Get to them before they even get to the medication. Now, there's a number of actions that I'm going to touch on that I think could help achieve this. And one of them is right on the front line of our health services. It's in the GP surgery. The problem, as I've mentioned, is we're not talking about our weight with our doctors. GPs say they don't have time or they feel embarrassed to bring it up. Every GP in the country is expected to ask every patient they see about their smoking, but not about their weight. And this needs to change. We need to be giving GPs and practice nurses support to tackle the issue, to reduce the stigma around weight, and to help them implement bold interventions to steer patients towards healthy life changes. And we know this works with alcohol. We know it works with smoking. This is what the poster behind me is designed to help happen, by the way, albeit with a tagline that's probably not going to work so well outside Newcastle. But tracking weight and body mass index, that early indicator of obesity and weight-related health problems, it needs to be standard practice for all patients. Every GP surgery should have a decent set of electronic weighing scales that can compute BMI. And everybody who walks through the door should have it recorded as a matter of course to flag up any worrying weight gain. There's compelling evidence that the simple act of weighing patients prepares them for the conversation about their weight, and that interventions by GPs in this context can support substantial long-term weight loss in obese and overweight patients. So in the midst of a major obesity crisis, why isn't weighing patients standard practice? And by the way, that goes for our kids, not just adult patients. By tracking their weight in their early years, problems can be addressed while there's still time to help them change habits. And it also helps counter this growing sense that being overweight is the new normal. But it can take the authority of a GP intervention to focus a parent's mind on the very real risks coming down the line for children who become seriously overweight in their primary school years. Training and equipping GPs and practice nurses to do this vital work would be small change compared to the billions the NHS is spending on dealing with obesity-related diseases. The long-term benefits would be felt in the nation's health and the NHS coffers for decades to come. Outside of this clear opportunity within our health service, we need to look at the wider food culture. Why are we buying so many foods that do us so much harm? It's because the food environment that we live in today is one that suits corporate greed and feeds off human vulnerability. The boundless availability of what are being called hyper-palatable foods, loaded with sugar, refined carbs, fat and salt. Many of them have negligible nutritional value, and they're destroying the health of the nation. The constant bombardment by advertising ensures that they're never very far from our thoughts. And the sheer ubiquity of the big brands that sell them, the presence on our streets, everywhere we look, means that they're rarely out of reach. Now, we may not be able to ban these foods, but we can surely oblige their manufacturers to be clear about what's in them. I've heard a bit about voluntary codes today. What about compulsory codes? I've been challenging some of our major brands to be upfront about what's in their products. And I've seen that if we simply wait for the food industry to do the right thing, we might be waiting a very long time. I've spent time with parents who struggle to work out what's in the food they're buying for their kids. They're led to believe a product's healthy when actually there are harmful amounts of sugar hidden in it. Corporations shouldn't be able to get away with making bold health claims on their packaging for children's foods just because they've added a few vitamins, for example, or because a cereal comes from several different grains. They can call it multigrain, when actually they're high in salt, sugar, or fat, and particularly, of course, in the case of breakfast cereals, sugar. The only way we can make healthier choices is if the manufacturers make it easy for us to do so. And I don't think the big corporations are going to do that unless they're told to do it by government. Every supermarket own brand cereal box has now got coloured traffic light labels on them, which make it clear how much sugar they have. Yet market leader Kellogg's has ducked that responsibility completely. So how is that acceptable? Universal, easily understandable labelling is required across all food products. Colour-coded, front-of-pack nutrition labels are proven to be effective and popular with shoppers. I think it's time to make them mandatory. We also must address the way that corporations market their food. Our children are endlessly targeted with adverts for junk food and confectionery. They're being urged to make unhealthy choices that will ultimately make them ill. And unless we take some control of that, we're going to be condemning another generation to a life of diet-related diseases. So, just as tobacco ads are restricted, so should junk food adverts be. We need a 9 p.m. watershed for junk food marketing. The current regulations are not doing the job. And we need stronger regulations and monitoring for out-of-home and online marketing of junk food. And we need to tackle point-of-sale deals and promotions on junk food, the kind of bog-off deals which invite us to supersize our least healthy choices just at the point we're making them. Surely we should be actively promoting the most healthy foods, not endlessly pushing the worst. And there's one more thing. There are many things, but there's one more thing I'm going to mention that we need to do to help turn the tide. We have to take the idea of education about food seriously. The best hope of reversing the obesity crisis once and for all lies with the next generation. And if we can educate our kids to make better, smarter food choices, and to understand how much those choices will contribute to their well-being, then we can better protect them from the grim future they currently face. I've seen this working. The Newcastle United Foundation, for example, has got a brilliant program called Match Fit that comes into schools and teaches kids about healthy eating, taking exercise, and about the vital connection between those two things. You cannot have one, as James has been telling us, without the other. This little program is done in a fun and engaging way. Kids designing plates of food, getting taught and then quizzed on the basics of nutrition. But it's an add-on and a drop-in. I thought it was brilliant, but I couldn't help asking myself, why is it left to a football club to properly explain to kids the importance of healthy food and taking exercise? Surely this is a matter of education for all. Of course, there are many schools doing excellent work with their kids on food and nutrition, and Zac's been telling us about some of the ones in his neck of the woods. But many more schools need the clarity of making such work an unambiguous part of the school curriculum. And that's a matter for government. And so are many aspects of the complex crisis of obesity that together we've been highlighting this evening. It's time for action, and it's time for leadership. The people who can make these changes are all here at this conference. The Health Secretary popped in for a few minutes, but I wish he'd stayed a bit longer to answer a few of these issues. And of course, I'm very much hoping to catch up with him later on while I'm here. Of course, everybody's very busy on Brexit. And sure, access to the single market, the free movement of people, these are important issues. But are they actually the most important things that are being discussed at this conference? Are they more important than the health of our nation, than the future of our National Health Service, than the life expectancy of our children? We can't go on delaying the moment when we properly recognize that obesity is the greatest health crisis of our age. And just as important, recognize that it's solvable. I really hope that this government meant what it said when it stated in the last obesity plan that this is just the start of the conversation, not the final word. Because if we've really already had the final word from government on obesity, then I think we're well and truly stuffed. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much to all our contributors. We've got 10 minutes, I think, for questions, if anybody wants to kick off. So I'm going to start with the lady in the blue top over here.
Hi everyone, and thank you so much for an insightful discussion on child obesity, which is actually very close to my heart. As you can probably tell, I am obese, and I was obese as a child. And I feel like, although we've covered a lot of issues here, the one thing we're not covering is mental health. And the reason that I am overweight and continue to be overweight is because I have suffered with a plethora of mental health illnesses over the course of my life. And when I was a teenager and I was young, I actually suffered with what some would call binge eating disorder, which is not covered in schools. When we talk about anorexia, we talk about like people not eating enough. I eat too much, and I'm currently a member of a weight loss group, but actually it's the same for most of the members. And I feel like we haven't, like, food is an emotional thing, and for a lot of children, it's an emotional thing. And I wondered what you would say around how we should merge mental health and the fitness of children going forward, because I think it's really important.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for asking the question. Okay, I'm going to ask Dolly to respond to that, because it's actually something that we have been talking about a lot.
Yeah, and then Hugh to come in as well. Thank you so much for raising that issue, because we do talk about that in the report. And I just wanted to make clear also that this event isn't the launch of the report, and we will be discussing kind of more of the in-depth detail when we get to that point. But we case studied the Lambeth Healthy Weight Programme, which is a very comprehensive Tier 2 service in Lambeth. And I'm not joking, I had so many case studies along these lines, and I got told when I showed them to people that they were so niche. You know, not everyone suffers a mental health issue. It is the norm. When it comes to childhood obesity issues in deprived areas, it is absolutely the norm. And the amount of complex social problems that these families are dealing with at the same time, by the time it's talking about, you know, can't you be sort of healthy and eating healthily and stuff, and this is a lesson in how to cook, it is meaningless. And so the kind of services that we're looking at needing to be available, and some of the stats are shocking in the report, that 25% of local authorities do not have a single healthy weight programme or weight management service available in their area that deal with these sort of complex issues. So we absolutely touch upon it. And again, I cannot emphasise enough, it is not about dealing with these siloed issues, childhood obesity, mental health, you know, separately. It is all one part of the same problem, and by tackling childhood obesity as almost the excuse to tackle a lot of other, you know, complex social issues on top, and often getting to the root cause of why that child is obese uncovers so many other issues, and, you know, really mental health is a major cause of it. So we absolutely touch upon it. It is absolutely in that report. And when it comes to the case studies that we look at for healthy weight programs that we would recommend the government introduces more, local authorities across the country, it absolutely is at its core.
I'm not sure if this mic is working. But yeah, there we go. I completely agree. I agree with what Dolly said, and I applaud you for bringing the subject up. It's absolutely vitally important, and it has to be among the options. I mean, I still think that the first port of call for many people is going to be their GP. And this is why we need so much better training for GPs to be able to deal with this issue and to know what the various resources that they can then go to are. My wife is a child psychotherapist working in Bristol for the NHS, and I know how incredibly stretched those resources are right now. And there's nothing like the capacity to deal with the sheer load of extreme cases that come their way on a daily basis. And so we need resources in all these areas, and we need appropriate options. It isn't just about giving a GP the option to refer somebody to Weight Watchers and think that that's going to do the job. It's much more complex than that. But I do think that if the training starts in the GP surgery and they understand what the raft of possible options is, and we develop that in line with the kind of proposals that I expect to see coming out of the CSJ report, then we can start to make progress.
The lady at the front here. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, my name is Sejal Bensali. I am a dentist, and I just wanted to highlight that the number one reason that children under the age of 5 are admitted to hospital is for extractions due to dental decay. So obviously this ties in with the obesity thing because it's a sugar problem. So I've just carried out a study at a nursery giving education to under 5-year-olds on diet and oral hygiene and things, and we had really interesting results. So I was wondering what the panel think, what age intervention should be given to children, like, you know, should it be as early as 2-3 years old?
Well, I don't think you can start early enough. I mean, the food education begins the moment children start eating, full stop. And so actually, the first point of call is to educate young mums. That's where it really starts. If young mums have got a good grounding and good understanding of what the first steps are in the very early stages that are going to give their kids the best possible chance. And it's amazing talking to professionals in this area, how many of them say, that's really where we need to start. If we talk, so it's one thing saying that really we've sort of messed it up for our generation, and the real potential gain lies with the next generation. We need to start thinking about that generation before they're born, by teaching their mums and dads how to get them off to a great start.
No, I mean, I would echo that. I think it actually starts before, it's from conception through to the end of the first 1,000 days, and understanding you have a healthy mother and understands what she's eating and the baby's going to be more healthy. And then, as Dolly was pointing out with the Amsterdam programme, the increase in breastfeeding and the benefits that gives, it is crucial to start off in the right way. And going back to dentistry, you can't view the first few years as free, in that you hear people go, well, the baby teeth are going to fall out anyway, let's start properly when the big teeth come through. That you've missed the opportunity to get the habit of brushing your teeth in. And if you apply the same analogy to food, if you weigh that long, you've missed the boat.
Preparing for a debate, I watched a programme called Junk Food Kids, and it was absolutely pathetic watching these kids having their teeth extracted, and they were crying and their mums were crying because their mothers were feeding them liquid sugar without understanding what the consequences were. And even fruit juices, which again, parents think are a healthy option, and they are absolutely stuffed full of sugar with the consequences for these kids.
I want to comment on one point. Just going back to School Food Matters, the Richmond and Kingston campaign. I mean, it's not just about the ingredients of the food that is eaten in the schools. It's the whole story. So you have kids in every one of the schools taking part. They learn how to cook food. They learn how to grow the food. If they don't have access to it in their own school grounds, then they'll borrow access elsewhere. But growing is a core part of the School Food Matters programme. They even sell food. If you go to Richmond High Street, you'll see kids every other weekend, stores learning a little bit about commerce, selling jars of jam or whatever it is they've made. It's become part of the curriculum. So complete, yes, lots of sugar in jam. Some of it is actually sugar-free, believe it or not. But it's not the point. It is the food being, it's a food culture being woven through those schools. So completely spontaneously, on the back of School Food Matters, not as part of the programme, in the 3 schools that I work closest with, and it may be true of the others as well, you have cooking clubs now after school for the parents who then come in and learn how to cook with their kids. It's something that has just happened very organically, but very, very rapidly.
But do you agree that we should actually get that into the curriculum?
Oh, completely. I sponsored a bill in Parliament. I think 2 MPs backed it. But I sponsored a bill in Parliament to try and push this. It was the first bill that I wrote with the help of our clerks in Parliament. I think that £2 billion budget should be 100% spent on the best possible food. I think food growing, food cooking should be part of the curriculum. I think it opens up a whole new world. And I do think it touches on the mental health issue. I mean, look, I can't answer you scientifically, but I can tell you that the 2 schools that were on their knees when I was first selected as a candidate, so roughly 10 years ago, are now the 2 best schools. The 2 worst are now the 2 best. And those are the schools that have embraced this agenda more than any other school in the entire area. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think getting kids outdoors, nothing's more boring than a maths lesson for a 7-year-old kid. But if you're outdoors and you're somehow weaving maths into growing food and counting the eggs and managing a small farm, which 2 of our schools now have, that makes education more interesting, makes it less abstract. And kids are designed to be active, they're designed to be outdoors. And I think it takes a lot to drive that sense of adventure and activity out of children. But as a society, we have spectacularly succeeded, and we're going to have to reverse that.
So I'll just add one more thing that I don't pretend to be an expert in any of this, but the question was about what age do we start, is that I think we overestimate or sort of underestimate the kids at what age they can pick things up and want to take ownership of it. And my kids I've got 3 kids, and I was having fights with them all the time to get them to eat, veg and fruit. And I said, right, we're going to go and pick it. And then once they picked it, saw where it came from, and then they chose what to make with it. And then they ate things that they just come and put in front of them. They didn't really have any concept of where it was, just they didn't like it. So I think we need to sort of empower them to know where it comes from, then what to do with it, and then they'll have more chance of eating it.
Unfortunately, we have run out of time, even though clearly there's a massive hands up. And I would like to thank our panel enormously for their contributions this evening. We've heard so many brilliant ideas, and that there is so much best practice out there. And you will see in the report when it comes out that this is a question of joining up that best practice into a proper holistic approach. And as Hugh says, it is for the government to listen. I mean, we've identified the scale of the problem. And although it is complex and difficult, and we've really begun to understand that as we've explored it, in greater detail, there are some wins that we could be making without too much difficulty, and I very much hope that with the Secretary of State's support and with the support of everybody in this room, who I think is committed to making sure that we do take action, that something significant will happen. So thank you all for coming. Thank you very much to our panel who've given us much food for thought. And enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.